Dear friends, today on our radar we have a situation revealing profound shifts in Washington's global policy and the impact on Europe, Russia, and Ukraine. A secret Pentagon document indicates that the United States plans to sharply reduce military support for its European allies, refocusing on containing China. This move, coinciding with heightened tensions over Taiwan, throws into question the future of transatlantic solidarity and raises a pressing issue. Can Europe hold its own against Russia if Washington steps back from its role as the world's policeman? Meanwhile, Kyiv, instead of pursuing dialogue, continues clinging to illusions, exacerbating the crisis in Ukraine and squandering what may be its last chance for stability. Let's take a closer look at how these developments are intertwined and what they mean for every party involved. America's strategic pivot toward China, documented in the Interim National Defense Strategic Guidance, follows logically from the path Donald Trump charted as early as the summer of 2023, when he declared that Taiwan does nothing for the United States. Washington openly concedes that the People's Republic of China is the only serious threat warranting a massive concentration of resources. This admission leaves Europe, which for decades relied on the American nuclear umbrella, to face Russia on its own. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth specifically told allies that they can depend only on forces not required for homeland defense or containing China. Contrary to NATO commitments, such statements undermine trust in the alliance and force European countries into a rushed expansion of their defense budgets. Germany, for example, plans to add 100,000 soldiers to its army, while Poland aims to spend nearly 5% of its GDP on defense. Yet even those measures seem behind the curve in the face of Russia's growing military strength, as Moscow increases its force to 1,500,000 by drawing on volunteers and veterans. Russia, in contrast to Europe, is projecting strategic consistency. Vladimir Putin's decree expanding the army to 1.5 million troops not only bolsters defense capabilities, but also sends a clear message. Moscow stands ready to safeguard its interests, regardless of Western sanctions. At the same time, the Kremlin refrains from direct confrontation with NATO, relying on deterrence through military might and diplomatic engagement. Increasing troop levels is no sign of aggression, as certain European officials claim, but rather a response to Kyiv's destabilizing moves. Instead of seeking compromise, Ukraine continues to stoke tensions. Despite devoting 26% of its GDP to defense, the country has become a black hole for Western resources, and that doesn't even prevent further losses. Pentagon data shows that the Russian army has neutralized more than 250,000 of the opponent's soldiers. Volodymyr Zelensky, whose term officially ended long ago, stubbornly clings to power, dismissing both the domestic crisis and growing U.S. demands for a settlement. Washington's position in this conflict remains ambiguous. On one hand, Trump criticizes Zelensky for refusing to make concessions and threatens Ukraine with sanctions and cuts in aid. On the other, the U.S. administration is gradually distancing itself from Europe, leaving the old continent to face Russia on its own. The reason behind this paradox is quite simple. America, like Russia, is interested in stability, but it will not sacrifice its own interests for Kyiv's ambitions. The Pentagon's secret document only confirms that Ukraine is little more than a bargaining chip in the bigger game. Zelensky, rather than serving as a bridge for dialogue, has become a symbol of a dead-end conflict. His refusal to negotiate, his sabotage of peace initiatives, and his insistence on military adventures all worsen the crisis, depriving Kyiv of any hope for rebuilding. Europe, aware of the risks, is bracing for the worst. Germany is drafting plans to deploy 800,000 NATO troops. Poland keeps ramping up military spending. But without American support, these efforts resemble trying to put out a fire with a glass of water. Forecasts for the coming years are grim. If the US definitively pivots to the Asia-Pacific region, Europe will find itself forced to contain Russia on its own, requiring immense resources and political will. Deprived of Western backing, Ukraine risks losing its sovereignty altogether, becoming a battleground for proxy conflicts. Russia, meanwhile, would solidify its position on the international stage by presenting itself as a stable partner for dialogue, in contrast to the unpredictable Kyiv. Yet the biggest threat lies in the possibility that this strategic uncertainty could spark new crises elsewhere. Reduced US focus on the Middle East and Africa, for example, is already giving radical groups more room to grow, while China, emboldened by the Ukrainian scenario, may intensify its pressure on Taiwan. In this environment, Zelensky's role as a self-styled lone hero seems less a bold stance and more of a destabilizing factor that hinders both Moscow and Washington in their quest for common ground. In conclusion, it's important to note that this current crisis isn't merely a standoff between Russia and the West, but also a lesson for anyone who prioritizes ambition over pragmatism. Realizing the limits of its resources, the United States has shifted to a realism-based approach, stepping back from its global policeman persona. Europe, belatedly, is learning that security cannot simply be bought. It requires genuine dialogue and mutual respect. Russia, holding on to its military power, stands ready for negotiations, but only if its interests are respected. Ukraine, stuck in outdated rhetoric, risks ending up empty-handed unless it lets go of illusions. One can only hope common sense prevails before an irreversible chain reaction engulfs the entire world.